and welcome to Beneath the Surface. Glad you could join us tonight. Paul Morano here for Beneath the Surface, where faith and reason meets. Attempting to bring a little sanity into our age of insanity, a little life into our culture of death. And as you see across the screen, my guest tonight, Mr. John Tudoris. John, welcome.
Hi, glad to be here.
Glad that you're here. What's it like being you tonight?
Well, it's tonight, so I'm here. It's good being me, you know. I'm sure, but
Yeah,
you being you is good also, and it's better for you to be you than to be me because you're you.
Yeah, and the thing is, I will never be you, so I have to keep asking what it's like being you. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, sure.
All right. Well, tonight we talk about we talk about a heavy subject tonight. And so just wanted to get the light stuff out of the way because tonight we're talking about crossing the line to infanticide. That's the name of our show tonight. Crossing the line to infanticide. A lot to say here. You know what's been happening in the news. I've been listening to what's happening in the news. We're actually in a situation in the history of our country where we have gone from the acceptance of artificial contraception to the acceptance of abortion or prenatal homicide, to the exception now, and I don't mean EX, I mean ACC, to the accepting of, that is, postnatal homicide or infanticide. Your thoughts?
It's a dangerous place to be. The sad thing is it's not unexpected. It's the natural course and progression of things. Once someone...
Well,
go ahead.
Well, what do you mean by you don't mean that it's the natural progression of things in terms of how things are supposed to be.
Sure.
It's the logical extension of, I think is what you're saying, right?
Yes. I use the term natural loosely here. If we're going to be good philosophers, natural would not refer to the course of action that people are taking now. Rather, like you said, it's the logical progression of the reason of people who've acquiesced to the contraceptive mentality.
Well, let me take you up on that, and let's try to get a bigger perspective on this before we get into the infanticide questions and everything that's happening today. Now, as you know, John, throughout pagan times, infanticide was not uncommon. You would have societies around ancient Israel sacrificing children to their gods. You know what happened with Malak and Baal and the Valley of Gehenna. It's all throughout Scripture and tradition. What was happening around the people of Israel, and God, of course, was weaning His people to get out of those practices, to get out of that idol worship and sacrificing infants. Do you think that we are now getting back to a situation where we could truly call what's happening now something that perhaps we are entering a post-Christian era?
Oh, I would definitely hold that to be true. In some ways,
or a new paganism.
Both actually. But the paganism of now, in some ways, seems to be more pronounced. And to some degree, collectively as a society, we would have more guilt involved in this because there has been a rejection of something that is good. Whereas in the ancient pagan world, they didn't have that good yet. They didn't have the benefit of the incarnation of Jesus coming onto the stage of the world.
Yeah, and as Scripture tells us, He is the light of the world. So He came to enlighten us as to, the value of human life, particularly, among other things. But in pre-Christian times, you did have what I call the trifecta of a culture of death. You had it before Christ, and that was contraception, abortion, and infanticide. And now you are beginning to have it in what some, historians or at least religious historians are calling a post-Christian time. So it's all coming back. First, it began with contraception, and we can talk about that a little bit, about how it how that all began, the acceptance of contraception after almost 2,000 years of all of Christianity, Protestantism, Eastern Orthodoxy, and Catholicism, all roundly rejecting contraception as being a violation of the natural law and a violation of God's law, to the acceptance or the accepting of abortion, to now what seems like the societal acceptance of infanticide.
Yeah, definitely creeping towards there. It's not wholesale yet, but it's certainly entering into that realm. And for those who aren't familiar, the news that you alluded to earlier was the state of New York, who recently
Yes.
passed perhaps the most liberal or permissive laws on the books of any state in the union. Basically, really, up until the woman is dilated and the child is right there in the birth canal, up
Right.
until that moment. And so the other point of concern, when I looked into this, there was some doctors who thought that I guess they don't need a second surgeon on hand, which is another one of the little quirks of the law. So that basically, if the child is actually born alive when they intended to abort, they're without that oversight. They sort of, if someone wants to abort the child, they will. So basically, the protection that would normally be in there is not. I don't really think about any other job that someone might have, whether it's manufacturing, office work, what have you. If there's any degree of desire, any sort of desire for good quality, there's always inspectors. There's always someone just double checking, okay, all right, yep, everything looks good, great, and then they just let it go off into production. Here, they're basically saying, we don't need that double check. So what that means
Right.
is that if someone says, well, just let the child die, and so it's sort of a permission in the law, not officially, but unofficially.
Yeah.
And people
Well,
think there's a good reason to believe that people will take advantage of that.
you're talking about the new law of New York State,
Correct.
which Governor Cuomo signed, and he did mention that this law is codifies the right to an abortion all the way up until the woman is dilated and ready to give birth. She can have an abortion right before. But then we had that little scene with the governor of Virginia saying that, in his legislation, that if there is a botched or a failed abortion, quote unquote, and the baby is born alive, then it will be up to the mother as to whether they want to try to revive and try to sustain the baby's life. So, they're no longer, it's becoming blatant, I guess. And other states are following suit now. I think they're all afraid that Roe versus Wade is going to be overturned. So they're doing whatever they can to solidify their particular state's laws regarding prenatal homicide. But isn't it inevitable, and this is what you were getting earlier, that prenatal homicide would eventually evolve into postnatal homicide? It's the same child. And if the woman decides to kill the child prenatally, and the child happens to survive, then the logical extension, it would make sense that these folks, these same people, would say that the woman had a right to abort, to kill her child, and so that extends till afterbirth, which I guess the bottom line here is that it has been uncovered that the real motive behind this whole abortion mentality is not to become unpregnant. It's to actually kill the child. Notice the distinction. It was always that the woman wanted to become unpregnant. Well, in a situation like this, when she does become unpregnant and the child remains alive, it's not that anymore. The mentality is you have a right to kill your offspring, and if a woman wants to kill her offspring, she can do it. This is demonic.
It really is bad. And then the logical extension after that is, if infanticide is accepted in law and in practice, then at what point does it go beyond that? To what point does the child have rights as a
A
human
right to
being?
live? Yeah, a right
Exactly.
to live. Yeah.
So if a
That's
parent
that's
says,
a good question.
yeah, oh, it really is, and 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 of course it's a very, very slippery slope. And of course, on the flip side too, it's no accident, I think, that the legislation of laws that are getting to the point of legalizing infanticide, there's also been pushes too on the opposite end of life to
Yeah.
end life there as well too. The suicide, euthanasia laws.
Yeah, and the most vulnerable parts of the human life cycle, the beginning and the end.
That's correct.
Um, yeah. So, how did we get here? We just talked about how in pagan times it was around. Um, in modern times, well, contemporary times, it's coming back. How did we get here? How
The
do you
short
go
answer.
from life is precious and life is sacred to we can kill human beings whenever we want as long as the woman says so?
A couple things come to mind. One is that there's an underlying philosophical movement that's been building for at least a few hundred years. It started in the Enlightenment / modernist movement in the 1600s, where
Right.
basically the desire to understand the world went from how do I conform my mind to the world so that I understand things as they really are to how do I conform the world to my mind. So truth
Yes.
in the mind of people started to become subjective. And it was a small, like, little ball of snow, if you will, at the top of the mountain.
Mm.
But now we have this avalanche 400 years later. So and one of the consequences of this ordering of the view of the world to the self is that morality becomes subjective rather than there being an objective reality that certain things are right or wrong. That is
Mm.
no longer the case. That is no longer
Let
the
me just
case.
let me just make a synopsis because I think what you're saying is really important. To the non-philosopher, for the longest time, mankind, since we can remember, has been seeking to understand his surroundings and who he is, both nature and human nature. And you're saying that this kind of took a turn in modern times. And with modern philosophy, it went from trying to seeking understanding of things as they are to projecting onto them what we want them to be. And
Yes.
so instead of us discovering truth, we actually create it. And it's the goal isn't to discover reality and conform to it like you and I do, and like you'd say most people did in the Christian era. But instead of that, it's to project onto reality outside of us what we believe reality is, and ultimately, this is a way to become our own gods, isn't it?
It is, and it's a losing proposition.
Yeah.
It really is, because
I
it
mean,
doesn't actually conform to reality. And the funny thing is, not funny as in haha funny, but interesting funny, is that every single person, every single adult who adheres
mm,
to this subjective view of reality on a practical basis behaves completely the opposite. They behave as
yeah.
reality is objective. For example, they breathe unconsciously. They have to breathe in order to exist. If they stopped drinking water or fluids within the span of 3 days, they'd probably die of thirst. If they stopped eating within 2 weeks, they would probably die of starvation. These practical realities, which they adhere to and which they objectively realize,
Mm.
they can't get away from. And yet,
So,
their
so
mind,
yeah.
yeah, their mind, when it comes to certain higher things that don't
Mm,
have matter, so to
yeah.
speak, the physical world, they can't touch it, taste it, feel it. That's where there's this murky subjectiveness that goes on in their minds.
Well, I think perhaps the biggest movement towards subjectivism isn't necessarily skepticism of the physical world, like you're talking about, but moral relativism.
Oh, it is. It is.
Yeah, it's not necessarily. I mean, there is an intellectual movement that says I can define things as I want, and that's what it is for me. But I think more so, particularly in the modern society and our society today, it's I can define morality as I want. And what's good for you is good for you. What's good for me is good for me. And moral relativism has really taken roots in our society and has become the ethic of secular humanism and has replaced natural law theory as our understanding of morality.
I,
That,
I think I would largely agree with that. And one way that we can, although not entirely across the board. I mean, if I were
mm,
to, for all the murkiness that we see in some of our laws and the behavior and ideas of people, on a practical level, some things you just can't get away from. If I go in and I hold up the 7-Eleven and they
yep,
and I get $1,000 from him and I get caught, guess what? I'm going to jail. I'm getting prosecuted. I stole,
yep,
and I would suffer the consequences from it. If I go over and I take a gun and I shoot my neighbor uh, in cold blood, you can bet your bottom dollar that if I'm caught, I'm going to jail. And in some states, or countries, they would even put me to death. That there's an objective consequence to killing and taking the life of another. So we steal, we take from another what is not ours. That's really, in a certain sense, that underlies the all of these things. That there's a selfish desire to take what is not ours from others,
mm,
and that actually comes really to the idea behind the contraceptive mentality, which underlies the whole abortion mentality, and even what we're creeping into now with the mentality that would allow for infanticide, is this idea that I can have sex without consequence, that somehow I'm a standalone being, that I don't have to worry about the other person, and I can do what I want, really. But
mm,
that's contrary to the nature of things. You can't get around the consequences of it. If someone has sex and
mm.
there's any degree of fertility, there is a chance that you are going to produce a child. The natural end of sex
Well,
is the production of children.
well, within this modern movement that we're talking about is that movement to try to avert the consequences. Now, you're right. Ultimately, you can't. You're just passing the buck. But the first huge step in this process of the three links is contraception. Contraception was, I mean, is the attempt to become the arbiter of human life so that we can have pleasure without consequence.
Yeah, yeah, pleasure without consequence. The feelings are what's more important, and
Yeah.
what I do shouldn't have any or doesn't have any bearing on my neighbor, which of course is completely false.
Yeah, and what happened was when the pill was invented and it was promulgated in the 1960s, it became popularized, and it created a contraception mentality that basically did two things. Number one, it created a premarital sex culture, which we never had in our country. And number two, it created an abortion culture, which of course we never had in our country, because now we can use each other for pleasure. And if somehow the natural end does occur, which we tried to avert unnaturally, and a pregnancy does happen, then it's a mistake. The contraceptive mentality says that it's not a sacred human being in the image and likeness of God. It's a mistake. What do you do with mistakes? You try to fix them, right? And that's supply and demand. That's what created the abortion culture.
Yeah, no, it really is. I mean, the only true way to actually um, avert the mistake is to actually just abstain from sex.
Well, that's the responsible way. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. It really is. And I would just to go back even further than that,
Mm.
say that even before the introduction of the pill, I mean, what was it in 1960 the FDA approved it, and by
Okay.
65 there's already in the U.S. there's already 6.5 million women using it, and that was of course the
Yeah.
same year. Was it Griswold versus
Yep.
Connecticut?
versus
and that,
Connecticut. Yeah.
yep, and that's the one where made the pill legal.
All right. Why don't we categorize this in our mind? We're talking about three links here, or
Sure.
three links to the chain. That is contraception, which inevitably leads to abortion, which inevitably leads to infanticide. And there are two roads that we can look at. Number one is the religious, and number two is the secular. So let's hold the secular aside for a second. Tell us what happened in 1930 with the Anglican Communion at the Lambeth Conference.
So Lambeth Conference, and this wasn't the first year that this was considered. This is actually the third decade in a row that it was considered. It's actually started in 1910. There were some petitions going in from the Rockefellers, and I believe principally it was David Rockefeller. So anyway, after a few decades of tickling the ear, by the time they get to the 1930 Lambeth Conference, they say yes. That in certain circumstances, within the bounds of marriage only, artificial contraception is permissive.
Now, if you read it, it was not only a bombshell, but it was just to open it up a little crack for married couples in rare situations. But it was the first time that door was opened a crack in all of Christianity, because like we said earlier, all of Catholicism, Protestantism, and Eastern Orthodoxy, everything that made Christians, we were all in agreement, all in unison, that contraception violated the natural law. It was a sin against the law of God, and it can never be done until this conference of the Anglicans. They were the first Protestant denomination, and since then, one after the other, like dominoes, fell to the pressures of the world, and they all accepted contraception, and except for the Catholic Church. And do we need to take a break? We need to take a. Okay, we have 1 minute left. So before we take our first and only break, but it's interesting, John, how here in the 21st century, other than perhaps naturalists, the Catholic Church is the only organization that still says that contraception is wrong and it violates the law of God and our very human nature.
Yes, officially we do. There are many, unfortunately, including many in the hierarchy, who actually thumb their nose, so to speak, at official church teaching. And I think that's also an important consideration on why this is actually allowed to go on and flourish in the secular culture too.
Yeah, because if Catholics were Catholic, the world would have been transformed.
Oh goodness, yeah.
Yeah. So what you're saying is Christ, through his official magisterium, has always taught that contraception is a serious violation against our human nature, but we don't always listen.
That's very true. We don't when
after
we
the
ought
break,
to.
John, got to take a quick break, but after the break, we are going to talk about how it is a logical extension in this whole thing, that the contraceptive mentality makes an abortion culture inevitable. And of course, because it's the exact same human being, abortion is going to eventually lead to infanticide, and it looks like that's where we're at today. We'll talk more about that right after this. You're listening to Beneath the Surface. Paul Morano with my guest, Mr. John Tudorus. Tonight on the topic, we're delving beneath the surface on crossing the line to infanticide. We'll be right back. Don't go away. Welcome back. Beneath the Surface, Paul Morano, guest John Tudorus. John, you ready for segment number 2?
Yes, I am.
Fabulous. All right, tonight on Beneath the Surface, we're delving beneath the surface on the topic of crossing the line to infanticide. And we all know what has been in the news lately with New York State and Virginia and Vermont and other states now shoring up their laws in case Roe versus Wade becomes overturned, and it seems to be seeping into post-birth abortion. Now, we're asking the question here, we're trying to delve beneath the surface, is how in the world did we get here in the United States of America that was once a thriving Christian nation who respected life, who basically the culture understood human life as being sacred and the image of God, to it is a thing and it's a human being if I say it is. And basically that's the abortion mentality. It's only a human being if I declare it to be. You know, we ignore biological science. We ignore Mendelian genetics, which really is the impetus for all of the laws before Roe versus Wade that outlawed abortion in all states, that we finally, with modern science, began to understand what makes babies and how the process happens, and that beyond a shadow of a doubt, human beings, me, you, and everybody else, begin our lives, according to modern science, at the moment of conception, John. Now we're ignoring that.
Oh, yes, yes. And before the break, we talked a bit about philosophical movement as far as how there's sort of this slow avalanche through history that gets us to the point where we don't look at reality as objective, at least on the higher
Right.
things. On the practical level, we always do because we couldn't survive otherwise. We also
Right, but
talked about,
intellectually, yeah.
yes, we also talked about how on a religious angle, that's really where the crack opened, starting with the
Yeah.
Lambeth Conference in 1930.
What was the, before you get to Humanae Vitae, what was the encyclical by Pope Pius XI that was in response to the Lambeth Conference?
Well, that was Casta Connubii, which was very interesting. So it came out after the Lambeth Conference, and of course the church
The same year.
Same year, and it was basically on what makes a good Christian marriage. So it wasn't necessarily a complete rebuttal, so to speak, but in another way, it really was, because it's looking at marriage in a holistic way.
It laid the foundation. Yeah, it laid the foundation of what marriage is, and in what marriage is as an extension of human nature. And of course, contraception violates that. It contradicts both love and life. And of course, God himself is eternally, infinitely, and perfectly love and life. In fact, in God, they're the same thing. And when you try to rupture that and separate that here on earth with contraception, literally all hell breaks loose on earth. So what happened from the Christian point of view, what happened between 1930 and 1968?
So
give a little synopsis.
Despite the fine rebuttal from Pope Pius XI and Casta Connubii, which really was, I encourage anyone who's listening, if you're not familiar with it, read it. It's available free online. No Casta Connubii.
It's a great encyclical.
Within the next few decades after that, it was like dominoes. All the various Christian communions, once the Anglicans broke, the others pretty much broke, either officially or unofficially. And the case of
when you say broke, you mean accept contraception in their denominations.
That's correct.
As being morally acceptable. Okay.
And most actually it ended up being official too. The lone holdout really at the end of the day was the Catholic Church. The problem, of course,
still is.
It is. Officially it still is, and it's actually not possible for her to change on that due to the guidance of the Holy Spirit. But on a practical level, on a ground level, there are many, 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 and we're talking not just lay people who hold to that, but even priests and even bishops who would at least, underneath the radar, so to speak, tacitly approve it. They would say things such as, well, act according to your conscience. And then they would stop right there, not actually explaining that a conscience actually has to be rightly formed. So, and really what that means to people is, well, how do I feel? Well, feelings are subjective. So if I feel that it's going to cost too much, if I feel that I don't want to support another child, then I'm just going to pop the pill, right? I'm going to sit on the condom. I'm going to do whatever I need to avoid it because I feel in my conscience. But that's not really a good conscience. That is a malformed conscience.
That is a malformed conscience. Conscience has to be formed according to the objective true and good. And this is exactly what, it's good as a good segue, it's exactly what Pope Paul VI tried to do in his landmark encyclical, which really wasn't landmark because all it did was reaffirm the Christianity's continuous condemnation of contraception and abortion which from the very beginning, we can see it in the Didache, the first century AD, the first catechism of Christianity. It condemns contraception, abortion, and infanticide. Pope Paul VI in 1968 with Humanae Vitae on human life basically reaffirmed this. And then, of course, all hell broke loose, and there were dissenters, and why isn't Humanae Vitae, one of the most beautifully written encyclicals there are, being praised and loved? Why isn't it just something that everybody loves, John?
For one, a lot of people don't know about it. Sad to say, they don't. And when they hear about it, they think, "Oh goodness, that's in some highfalutin theological speak. That's just for bishops. I'm not going to be able to understand it." I can tell you firsthand, having read it,
it's pretty simple.
It is. It is actually written with the mind that the average person, average literate person, is going to read it and they're going to get it.
It's both simple and beautiful.
Yes.
And you read an encyclical like that, and Castitz Nubi, and you're inspired. You see how it just says there's a yes factor when you read those things. Like, yes, this is why human life is so valuable. This is the natural order. There's a certain wonder and beauty to it that we've lost in modern times. And I think one of the reasons we lost it is because we have been blinded by the contraceptive mentality, which now let's look at the line of progression in the secular world. Let's begin with what led up to Griswold versus Connecticut in 1965 in the United States.
Well, so there was testing done on the pill that was happening in the 1950s. And basically, by the time you get to 1960, the FDA had actually approved its usage. Keep in mind, the FDA approved the usage before it actually became legal. We'll put legal in quotation marks because it wasn't actually an enacted law. It was actually happened. It was judicial activism, if you really want to put it, because it's actually not the proper place of the courts to actually enact law. But needless to say, that's at least the way what seemed to have happened. So 1965, Griswold versus Connecticut, artificial contraception is okay. And that was within marriage too. That was
only within marriage.
Yeah.
And you know what? People will think today, of course, contraception has always been all right. How can you make it illegal? It was illegal up until 1965. That's why, like you said before, some states were legalizing it, but as a rule, as a law, most states were not, because it was not legal. It was not legalized by the federal government, and so most states, contraception was illegal. It was impossible to get it. You would be arrested and fined heavily if you sold contraception. That's what it was like before Griswold versus Connecticut. That was America.
Yeah, and it's so we see first in the Lambeth Conference in England, 1930. Within a few decades later, that mentality creeps in over here in the United States, and then we see it basically enshrined into law in 1965. So that's 35 years later. So then, of course, the next major step is we're looking at Roe v. Wade. And this is probably the one that people are most familiar with as far as court laws on the topics we're talking about today.
Roe versus Wade, yeah. Now, if you notice, there is a pattern internationally that every people in every nation that accepts abortion, that legalizes abortion, first has accepted and legalized contraception. And it's not too long after the acceptance of contraception that abortion becomes legalized. We saw it in the United States, Griswold versus Connecticut, and then Roe versus Wade only 8 years later. We saw it in Ireland just a little while ago, and in other nations, the same pattern. Once a people accept contraception, the separation, the prevention of human life, the prevention, not the avoidance of, but the prevention of by artificial means, then almost inevitably you can expect an abortion culture. And that's what happened in the United States with Roe v. Wade, huh?
Oh, it is. It's a basically once you no longer respect the natural end of the sex act within marriage, then it's inevitably going to happen. If you follow the chain of logic, well, you know it no longer is there for the giving of life. Okay, well then we can just have it for pleasure, right?
That because you become the arbiter of human life,
That's right.
not God, but you, and you can do it your way, which means, boiled down, we can use each other for pleasure without purpose. When you separate pleasure from purpose, all hell breaks loose.
It's the idea that you can have sex without responsibility. The practical reality, of course, is far different than that. There's always responsibility that comes with it.
Yeah. Well, the problem, of course, one of the problems was the contraceptive revolution, which the world or sociology calls the sexual revolution, was basically an acceptance of contraception, creating a fornication revolution. So all of a sudden, we had a premarital sex culture beginning in the early 1970s. That was because so many people were on the pill. So all of a sudden, sex is taken out of marriage, and it's divorced from baby making. So what does it become in this contraceptive mentality? It becomes something you do for the heck of it, for recreation. It has no meaning, no purpose, and the natural order is just shot with regard to contraception. And of course, this, it's going to become a mistake that you want to fix. A supply and demand is going to demand an abortion culture, and that's exactly what Roe versus Wade did for us. And ever since then, approximately 1.3, 1.4 million preborn children have been brutally killed in the womb every single year since 1973.
Yeah, it's actually really staggering if you really start to think about just how many children that is, and not just how many children have actually been explicitly killed and counted in abortion. Then, of course, we're not talking about the fact that the pill itself is often an abortifacient, causing
It is.
children to be expelled out of the womb.
We're going to do a whole show on that.
Yeah, or right, or the fact that we actually have lost at least one or two lost generations of people. Can you believe that?
Yes.
Lost generations of people that didn't even have the chance to exist because other people were denied the right to life.
Yeah, well, since 1973, when Roe versus Wade was made legal, abortion was made legal through it, we have lost approximately 1/3 of all human beings that have been conceived. Now, if you look around at any crowd that you see, or any sporting event, or any place that you go, any classroom that you have, those under 46 years old today, 1/3 are missing due to prenatal homicide.
Yeah.
1/3 of them. And so, like you said, now we're in that second generation where their children are missing because they never got to exist, because their parents were aborted before birth.
We're even for that third generation too. If you're thinking approximately every 20 years or so as a generation, I mean, it's, some people, some of these people actually could have been grandparents by now.
So this degradation of human life went from trying to prevent it to trying to kill it before birth. And if that is not done in an efficient way, now the law is beginning to say, well, post-birth abortion is okay. I mean, you meant to kill the child anyway, so doesn't the mother still have the right to enable that child to die if the child is born alive? This is inevitable, but this is what's happening now, John.
Yeah, and it's sad to say it really is a logical progression. When when the natural end of the sex act is not respected, when it's pursued just for the sake of pleasure or for some other selfish motive, then inevitably you will get all these consequences. You will get not just the contraceptive mentality, of course, which is inherent. That's at the root of it. You get the abortion, which many people actually see as contraception 2.0. And then, of course, really, and then from there, infanticide, contraception 3.0. And not
It's
even
sick,
just
but
that.
it's kind
As
of
an
funny.
aside, tangential to this all too, is actually even the homosexual marriage and the pursuing of that, because what is the main purpose of marriage? Well, it's not just the union of spouses; it's the begetting and raising of children. Well, you can't beget children if you are not compatible parts, so to speak. So,
You know, yeah. You bring up something very profound, and we'll probably have to save it for another show. But meaning and purpose are no longer important to the human being. And what's interesting is that's exactly what makes us human. We want to understand meaning and purpose. You know, the first two words that we say when we pop out of our mothers after mama and dada are what and why. What? What? What's this? What's this? And after a little bit, why? Why? This is human nature. This is what differentiates us from all the other animals. Needing to know that immaterial part of us needs to be fed to understand what, why, meaning, purpose. Now, take that away from human life and human living, particularly human sexuality. If there's no meaning, if there's no love and marriage involved, which is the meaning of it, and if there's no purpose, which of course is the procreative, that's the reason why we have sex, us and all the other animals. Take away meaning and purpose. What do you have left? All you have is the fringe benefit or the motivation, and that is pleasure. That's not a meaning or a purpose. That's simply what could motivate the people to do it.
yeah, but people are chasing after the accidental features and not pursuing the real substantive essence of it all. And that's really the
Yeah,
meaning and purpose, right? I mean, if the Sex Act is there for production of children, and
yeah.
it's really what it is. I mean, and you can't get away around it. Uh,
It's the
then,
natural end.
then when you remove that, that's it. That's it. You have
Yeah,
now nature, of course, abhors a vacuum. So what ends up happening is people fill it with all these other things. Oh, if it's not children, it's for the quote unquote relationship. Whether that be with someone of the
right.
opposite sex, of the same sex, or now, of course, you get into all sorts of other, transgender or whatever names they're calling themselves these days. I lose track of the
Yeah.
pronouns. I mean, all of them are actually related to the contraceptive mentality. That's actually at the root of it all.
Marriage, sex, and babies. Very simple. Marriage, sex, and babies. They're three parts of the one thing. They're three parts of the one whole, which is the family. Contraception has ruptured all three of those parts. Now they're all single parts that are unrelated to the other two. Sex you can do for fun. Marriage you can do if ever you want, and it doesn't have to have anything to do with children. Children you can have, married or unmarried, and if you don't want them, you can prevent them. You can try to prevent them with contraception. You can kill them before birth, or now you can allow them to die by murder by negligence, it seems, and some of these newer laws after birth. This is where we are today, John.
Yeah, you said it well. We don't mind, as shocking as it sounds, we don't mind killing our own children.
It is utterly bizarre. It's totally barbaric, and it's very demonic. I mean, what else can you say about it? Now, here's my next question. How far is this going to go? It seems like now that we're seeping into infanticide or post-birth abortion, how far is this going to go that parents or the state or whomever is going to have a right to kill the innocents?
It's a very, very fair question. I know in the ancient world, they actually got to the point of not just infanticide, but even actual young children. In the sacred scripture, in the Bible, Old Testament, we're talking offering up their children, just like you heard these horror stories of the Aztecs offering up human sacrifice.
Yes.
They did it in the Bible too. There's the
On a
Baal
regular basis,
worship,
yeah.
the Moloch worship.
Yeah.
Moloch eats his children. That's one of the very interesting punchlines from G.K. Chesterton about the contraceptive mentality. You know,
You know,
what
a
are
lot
you
of people might be,
sacrificing your children for?
you
They're
know,
a gift.
a lot of people might a lot of people might be listening to this right now and saying, "Oh, we'll never ever get to that. Yeah, that's crazy." Well, first of all, 50 years ago, abortion was crazy. If you would have mentioned that, people would say, no, that would never, ever be legalized. No
Yeah.
way in the world. It was legalized. Now we're talking about post-birth abortion or infanticide. You know what? There have been academics speaking about, post-birth abortion for a while now. And, Peter Singer from Princeton comes to mind. But I think there are others that have at least proposed the questions regarding human life, and that is, when is a human being a real person and have moral status? And, until what point can a parent, or particularly a mother, decide that they do not want this child to be alive? And particularly if the child is imperfect, if they have a disease or what have you, at what point? And I think some are saying, well, maybe a few days. Pretty soon it'll be 3 years, because if you were to look at what makes us truly human, different from all the other animals, you could say, well, maybe self-consciousness comes, kicks in right around the time where we're able to have memory, all the way back to around 3 years old. And, I wouldn't be shocked, mark my words, that somebody's going to come up with a proposal for post-birth abortion until 3 years old. I think it's going to go all the way to 7, because 7 is the age of reason. And reason is what really differentiates us from all the other animals. There's going to be this is where we're going. And the bottom line is, the snowball continues. The slippery slope continues. Where it's going to end, this culture of death of ours, who knows? 2 minutes left. 1 minute left, John.
That's an excellent question. I really don't know where the end game is. History shows that it can actually get much worse, sad to say. My 2 cents is, if you recognize what the problem is, become part of the change. That starts first with ourselves.
Yes.
If we're doing the wrong things ourselves, look to reform that in ourselves. And then 2 is, if you need to talk about the truth, learn how to speak it well. But if you have to share it, you
Educate
have to
yourself.
share it. Educate yourself.
Yep.
And by virtue of doing that, you'll be able to communicate it well to other people as well. I mean, there are other people, they'll say to you, oh, I do this, I do that. And, within right context, we're human beings. We need to communicate these things. Otherwise, no one else will know.
And you got to be courageous. Well, I mean, it's either going to go one way or the other. At this point, we're either going to self-destruct or we're going to convert and change our way. It's got to go one way or the other, and you and I and everybody listening to this has that responsibility before God and before each other to be part of that change, to be part of that light and that part of that persuasion. Wisdom and courage, John. Last word?
And prayer. Prayer and fasting. Scripture
Thank you.
says this type of evil needs prayer and fasting, no question.
And that's extremely important. Thank you for bringing that up. Going to have to end it here. Thank you so much. Tough topic, but it's got to be talked about. We've got to combat it together. Mr. John Tudoris, thank you for joining Beneath the Surface. Thank you for listening, everybody. Paul Morano signing off for another show of Beneath the Surface. Until next time, have a great week. God bless.